There's a snowstorm outside, but the markets are very happy and warm with the data that came this morning. Well, was this a surprise? Because expectations were around 165, 170,000, but we have something over 200,000.
Yeah, it was. You know, it was a bit of a surprise. Yeah, so the total number was higher than expected, and the private payroll number was quite strong because government actually fell 10,000. What's also interesting is the average work week increased a tenth of an hour. Now, that may not seem large, but when you multiply that against the new number of new jobs that are being created and people are working, that's actually quite a powerful figure. And it means that we're actually getting more contribution from employment to GDP than we had previously thought.
So is the next important and the big question about the budget cuts, the sequester, because sustainability is very important to this number.
That's right.
In spite of the budget cuts, will we be able to sustain these increases?
It's a great question, and I think the jury's out right now, and we're not clear on whether that can be sustained. If you look at the analysis that the Congressional Budget Office has done, the sequester, if it remains in place through the calendar year, or at least through the fiscal year, yeah, the end of September,
starting October, yes.
You could take 0.6 off of percentage points off of real GDP growth, and this is already still a very sluggish economy.
Right.
So even though we created over 200,000 jobs in the month of February, this is still far below what we need to really absorb all those excess, unemployed people. But the sequester also will prevent or maybe have a destructive force on employment. So they estimate that 700,000 jobs that otherwise would be created won't be created.
Otherwise, 700,000. So are we going to lose 700,000 people from the?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, some of it could be lost for sure, but a lot of it could be just that otherwise they would be created, but they won't. So going forward, maintaining, as you asked me, that 200 plus pace is maybe very difficult in the face of this. If you look at 700,000, over a year, you're talking about 60,000 or so per month that you're taking off of potential trend employment.
So it all depends on the Senate right now.
It does.
In a way.
It does. And the House, although the House seems more inclined to kind of try to water down the sequester, but I don't think either side, Democrats or Republicans, are going to make material change to the sequester. I think that they're quite comfortable seeing how this plays out, and my concern is that it will last throughout the fiscal year, and even though the fiscal year ends September, some of these authorized cuts really wouldn't take effect until the next fiscal year, so it could be the fourth quarter of this year that we also have a depressed impact. So it's the whole calendar year that can be affected.
Under this light, do you expect to see Fed doing some kind of intervention, continuing with the stimulus?
Well, I think what you probably see is the Federal Reserve continuing to do quantitative easing. There's a lot of debate among the FOMC members, the Federal Open Market Committee members, about some of them saying we need to slow down the quantitative easing, that we're maybe doing too much, that things are getting better quicker than we thought in terms of the economy and job growth. But I think the sequester and the fiscal tightening really gives Fed Chairman Bernanke, Janet Yellen, who's the vice chairman of the Federal Open Market Committee, strengthens their argument that no, we're not out of the woods yet, and the economy is still not strong enough. Let's continue at the pace we're at. So it's an interesting debate. Now, I guess it raises the question, if the economy really slowed down dramatically, would they increase quantitative easing? I think it's too early to say that.
It's too early to say if they will increase quantitative easing. Let's go back to the breakdown of today's non-farm payroll. Where do you see the most increase coming from in terms of the sectors?
Well, it was what was somewhat surprising was construction was up 48,000, right? So housing, but is it, as I say, somewhat surprising because housing's been doing quite well. If you look at the growth rates of the sectors of GDP, residential investment's been growing double digits, and we think that continues. Housing, new home sales in January were up 15%. So maybe we shouldn't be surprised that many jobs were created. Now there was
from construction, right?
From construction, and it's not just residential, but you're seeing a little bit of the non-residential as well.
About manufacturing, did it satisfy your expectations and your forecasts?
Yeah, it came pretty close to what we would have expected. I mean, the auto sector has been strengthening. Auto sales have pretty strong.
So construction and auto sector, just like Fed said in the Fed Beige Book.
That's right. And those are the interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy. So the Federal Reserve.
They are interest
Yeah, so they're
sensitive.
right. So So the Fed Reserve could certainly make the argument, no, quantitative easing is working. Look at the two sectors that would benefit most are doing well.
Because they are interest rate sensitive sectors, as you put.
Right.
Kathy, I want to go back to also, again, another number, which is the unemployment rate that came down. But is it misleading? Because it comes from another survey. Is 7.7% not a very good number for you? What do you say about that?
You know, I think it is a good number.
It went down
in
from
general,
7.9.
7.9 to 7.7. We'll take that. But in all seriousness, some of it came because of the labor force, people dropping out of labor force participation did drop 0.1%, and you saw 130,000 people drop out of the labor force. So when you do the math, that shrinks the denominator, that helps decrease the unemployment rate. But obviously it doesn't mean the labor market's really better. It just means people left. However, jobs in the payroll report did increase 170,000. So it's not entirely due to the labor force shrinking. I would say half of the decline. So we could easily say, if you adjust for that, I didn't do all the math, but I could say off the top of my head, maybe the unemployment rate's 7.8 once you adjust for the drop in the labor force. So it's still a decrease. And you know, there are two different surveys, but the non-farm payroll survey is really more reliable.
And also they revised the previous month.
They did. Now, January was down a little bit. December was revised up in terms of payrolls. But I think overall what we're seeing with this report and then remember last month's was really big revisions, right? So
amazingly.
They added 30,000 to the trend growth, monthly trend growth. So we went from 150,000 previously to 180. That's a big increase over, and it was not just 1 year, it was 2 years.
2 years, that's right. And you, at the beginning of our conversation, mentioned the contribution to the GDP. Can you repeat it for us? Because it's important to emphasize it. And then going forward, what should we expect to see from that?
You know, I'm glad you brought me back to that point because it is critical. So what you see is the number of people working, and then that's the number of hours they put in every week. You multiply those two, and that's sort of what your workforce contribution is. It's what they call it aggregate hours worked. So when both go up, that's an indication not only are we hiring more people, but they're working longer. So your contribution of work to the economy has increased. Now, the interesting thing is, will GDP be higher as a result of it?
That's right.
That's a tricky question. We think that GDP growth is still weak in the first quarter. That means productivity growth is going to...
First quarter of 2013, right?
2013, yes.
Is it still slower?
That's right, still slower. And that means productivity growth could continue to be slow. We just got the productivity report for the fourth quarter, and it was negative.
That's right.
So that's not great. And that can't continue forever. We can't see employment growth outpacing GDP growth. That can't continue. So the question then becomes, does GDP growth increase or does employment slow? At some point, I wouldn't say it's going to happen immediately, but at some point, those two, we need to have positive productivity growth.
When do you expect to see that, given the conditions, right?
Yeah, it's a tricky, and again, the sequester makes it tricky. So yeah, so these data were pre-sequester, obviously. Now everything going forward is going to be affected by the sequester. So it's very difficult, I think, to get a clean read on what's really happening.
You have 2 scenarios.
We have a couple scenarios, yeah, and I would say the government sector is going to be more affected by the sequester than private, but private will certainly be affected. If you think about, for instance, defense contractors, right? They're in the private sector, so if they have cutbacks from the government, they're going to be cutting back on their outlays for hiring or for spending. So it does have an impact on the private sector as well.
What is your GDP forecast?
Well, we have less than 2% for the first quarter, and we're still finalizing our second and third quarter numbers, but I think that second quarter, it wouldn't be surprised if it's below 1% now with the sequester. Previously, we would have had higher growth, and we did expect the economy to strengthen in the second half of the year.
Right.
Now that may not happen, not as much as we thought.
Not as much as we thought. Yeah. Anything else that I forgot to touch or you wanted to give as a message, because this is our last 10 seconds?
Sure. Well, I think the average unemployment earnings number went up a little bit, but still year on year it's very weak. So earnings are not keeping pace, and they're still quite weak because the unemployment rate's still high.
Relatively. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
It was amazingly informative and also future forward going. You gave us your estimates as well.